Alright, so in this presentation we're just going to look at what it means when we have ELLs in our classroom and how are we actually thinking of these students so that we are actually providing them the kind of education that they need in order to be successful and really looking at them as more than just the kid that's sitting in our room in a given moment. So that's what we want to begin with is some ways that teachers typically view their classroom experiences and the way that they view their students that kind of fundamentally present problems to ELLs when we have them in our classrooms. So first I want to start with the problem of the desk. When we're looking at how teachers on a given day see their students in their classrooms, it's very tempting to take on this view that I look at my students and I see them as who they are right now in this moment, and I see the need that they have in this moment, and I don't, and it's very difficult sometimes when I look at all the things that I am accountable for and all the responsibilities that I have. It's really easy to not see the big picture of the fact that this kid is also a student in other classes. This kid is also going to grow up and leave my class and eventually become an adult. And that the things that I am teaching in this lesson should be able to carry with that child into those other classes and into those experiences in the future. And so when we're teaching, oftentimes we forget that and we teach lessons that are designed to get a student to do some work during a given class period or get a grade so that we can mark that in the book and not get bothered for having low failure reports, things like that. So when we are looking at our students this way, this can pose problems to the way any student is served when they come into our classrooms. So we're going to take a look at that and we're going to connect that to some other ideas in a minute. So let's hold on to that. And I want to take a look at also how we look at the learning process. So we look at our students in isolation. We also look at the learning process a lot of times as more task-based than thinking-based. Now this is not all teachers, but it happens a lot, and especially when we're thinking of what do I need to do within a given class period to get my students to be successful? What do I need to do in a given class period for my students to pass? A lot of times we think of the tasks that they do and not so much the learning that they need to hold on to for life. So we think of things as something to accomplish. We think of rigor as being more work for a student to do, not necessarily more thinking. So we typically use words like, you need to get your work done, or you did not complete this assignment, or you did not get blank finished on time, therefore you don't have a bad grade. We're communicating to students that their place in our classroom is to finish things and to get stuff done. So if we take that and we combine that with the idea that we have students in a room that are being served in the given moment, in that given moment we're thinking of things that they need to do and finish to get a good grade, and then we couple that with our perception of our students themselves. So what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to bring this all together. So what I want to do is kind of hold on to the fact that we've talked about students in isolation, we talked about learning as a task. Now I want to take students themselves and think of how do we look at our ELLs, and then we're going to put it all together and talk about where we're going to go from there. So when I have a student in my room and I'm thinking of them in isolation, I may have some preconceived ideas as to what kind of ELL I may actually have. Because when we have an ELL on our list, typically a teacher may kind of pigeonhole that student into a certain type that they believe all ELLs kind of fit, even though there are many different ELLs and many different ways that we can classifications of ELLs. So typically we find these are like kind of the three main groups of ELLs that we'll see in our classroom. We have students that are recently immigrant, that are academically strong, but they just need more development of their English language proficiency. They have the background knowledge. They've seen what they're learning in their content classes in their home countries. They know this vocabulary in their native language. It's just a matter of transferring to English, and that typically happens very quickly. We also see the middle child here, a recent immigrant with limited education. They may have weak literacy in their native language. They struggle a lot in their classes as a result because they don't have a strong formal education background. They may not be accustomed to how things happen in a public school, and as a result may have behavior problems because of that. A lot of times teachers imagine their ELLs being this student. So when they see they have a list of students in their ESL, their LEP list, their ELL list, they typically imagine this middle child, even though, as we're looking over here on the left, there are a lot of students that actually are academically very capable, and we're not really giving those students due justice in our classrooms because we're thinking that all of my ELLs are this child in the middle, coming from a poor educational background, weak in literacy, and as a result, we feel that we need to lower our expectations for that child. Also, at the end, a very large population of our students are LTELs, kids that have been here for some of them were born in this country, and because of testing in their home language, qualify for programming, but are very socially strong in English. And so a lot of times teachers have struggles figuring out what to do with these students because they think that these students are fine because their oral language is easy to understand, there's no accent, it sounds like these kids are ready to go when really their academic language is strong. So we're not really seeing the big picture either of the kind of service we're supposed to provide students when we don't really see that there are more than one type of ELL in our rooms. So, putting it all together, if I have a tendency to look at my students in isolation and I'm not seeing the big picture of those students and how my influence in my classroom and my lessons are going to impact them in the future, if I'm looking at my course and the work of my course as a series of tasks to complete and not necessarily paying attention to the learning that the child is supposed to have, and I'm not paying attention to developing lifelong skills, if I believe that rigor means more work and that my more capable students are going to receive that more and more challenging work, where my less capable, like my ESL students, are not going to receive that, if I'm looking at ELLs as academically incapable of hard work, and I believe that all my ELLs are the same, then we have to ask the question, what kind of education are we actually providing these kids? If we have all of these kind of negative influences into how we prepare lessons, if we have all these biases kind of in our minds about what kind of education we're providing students, what are we really doing to meet the needs of these kids, and how are we really preparing them for their futures if we have some fundamental problems in place? Now, like I said, this is not every teacher, but in working outside of the classroom, I've seen this happen a lot. And I know that in conversations, even with really good teachers who really do care for these kids, it's really easy to lose sight of the big picture of what we're supposed to be doing to help a kid actually be prepared for life. And it's really easy to lose sight of the fact that my class is supposed to be something that develops skills that last for life. And the thinking that happens in my room should develop the student into a better learner, into a better individual as they move it forward in their education, and should help them to pursue any kind of dreams that they have for themselves. So for that, I want to make it a little bit personal. These are three guys that I have worked very closely with. They're all adults now. They're in their 20s. One of these guys is actually married. So at this time, you're looking at these pictures, and when in the moment when I took the pictures with these guys, this was a very happy moment. They're in their cap and gown. They made it. Some of these guys, it was a big struggle to get to that point. So it was a really really happy moment. So we're typically, as teachers and educators, when we see this, we think, success, we did it. Here we've gotten to the end goal, and these guys graduated, and we were successful. They met the requirements, and here we go. What we're not seeing is what happens after this. This is a very happy moment, yes, but after this, each of these three guys went on to community college to pursue dreams that they had. Not one of them was able to test into college level. I don't know how other states work, but in Texas, if you are going the community college route and you didn't take an SAT, we have a test called the Texas Success Initiative that determines if you are college level in reading, writing, and math. These guys couldn't score college level in any of those areas. And so as a result, you take developmental courses, which is good. I'm glad that it exists. It helps build the skills that you need. The problem was that these guys weren't successful in even those developmental courses. To be able to get to college level, you have to pass those developmental courses first. That's time. That's not earning credits. That's money. That's not earning credits. And when these guys pursued that and were still not successful, 2 out of these 3 guys have left college and have no plans to continue. That is a tragedy. They had dreams that they were trying to pursue. We told them, you are ready to go. They were sitting in classes where teachers looked at them in isolation. Teachers had preconceived ideas about what they were capable of, and as a result gave them tasks to complete that were not rigorous, were not challenging, did not promote skills and higher order thinking, and as a result took that work, counted it as credit, and passed them along. Some of these guys received 85s, 90s in classes like Algebra 2, however, couldn't pass the Algebra 1 assessment to graduate from high school. It took them 4 or 5 times to do that. And that's not, that's more than just these 3 students here. That's a lot of the students I've worked with. How is that possible? How can we say that a student can get a 90 in an advanced math course but can't pass the one that's 2 levels down? We're doing something wrong. We're not looking at these kids in the correct way. And by looking at their time in our classes in isolation as just get it done, finish, get the passing grade so nobody bothers me, that kind of a thing, we're actually preventing these kids from being able to pursue the dreams that they have for themselves. One of these guys wanted to be a pharmacist, and that's not happening now. And it's been very disillusioning for a few of these guys. One of them was actually in my office at that time, crying because he really didn't know what he was going to do with himself. They had plans, they had dreams, they were going to pursue them through college, and they couldn't do it. And it wasn't that they weren't trying. They were in class every day. They were talking to their teachers. They were bringing their work even to me to help them. And it was still so much of a struggle. They didn't have the skills that they needed to pursue this successfully. So we don't want that to happen anymore. We want to teach our students when they're in our rooms with that future in mind. What am I doing now that's going to build you into the kind of learner you need to be, that you can pursue anything you want and not be hindered? So what do we do about that? In our classrooms, we need to focus on that child, not the here and now. Recognize that they are not going to stay a child, that they're going to become a grown-up, and that what they do in our class should develop them into a better grown-up. We need to stay true to learning targets with all students. All of us, no matter what state we're in, have some kind of core content that we follow, whether that's in Texas, our TEKS, or if you are in another state, the Common Core. That is our responsibility to teach that, and those standards present the thinking that's supposed to happen. They delineate what kind of higher order skills are supposed to be going on. We need to make sure that we're not reserving those skills only for the students we deem as academically able, like our advanced students, our honor students, or our more motivated general ed students. We need to recognize that if a kid is in our class, it is our responsibility to get them to that level, period. If it's an ESL student, they are the same boat. They have to get to where they are thinking at the level described in that objective. And very importantly, we need to look at multilingualism as an asset, not a problem. That is a sign of intelligence. When somebody speaks more than one language, typically we respect that. But however, when we have ELLs in our classroom, we typically look at them as less capable of learning than some of our students who are monolingual English speakers. That doesn't make sense. If a student has more than one language under their belt, that's a good thing. We should be respecting that and providing them opportunities to enhance that intelligence, not think of them as less than. So here is illustrated kind of exactly what I've been talking about. This is an example of when educators take an expectation for their ESL students, their ELLs, and reduce those or lower those expectations based on their own bias or their own interpretation of what they think these students should need. So over on the left is the list of what Texas Education Association says acceptable linguistic accommodations should be for a student. That's our job, is when a student is in our room as an ESL student or an ELL, we need to provide accommodations for their language, which means just make room for the fact that you're learning a new language and help you to attach to the learning. I'm not going to make things easier on you. I'm just going to make sure that, your language doesn't inhibit you from learning the content that we have. So if you're looking at the one on the left, these are good accommodations. They actually do meet that goal of just making room for your language growth. The first one there, peer and native language support. We're still working on communication. We want to elicit language from you. We're not trying to inhibit it. This one in the middle here, extra time for complex material and or assignments. What I like about that is, yes, we're giving you extra time, but it's because the expectation is still that you complete complex material and assignments. So over here we're seeing what a true accommodation should be. Over here on the right, when I did a Google search on this, I found that this was a school district's interpretation of these accommodations, and they actually labeled this document as the TEA accommodations. But you'll see there is a huge difference between the two. A couple that really scare me. The first one, lower the reading level. When you communicate that to a teacher, that could be an acceptable accommodation at some point. If a student really is below grade level in their literacy, that's fine if you begin by lowering the reading level of an assignment, but it should also be communicated with a message that that level needs to be brought back up. Once we've established that initial um, comprehension of the text, we need to bring the level back up to grade level so that we can look at more complex grammar structures and more academic vocabulary. So if I simply just give this list to a teacher and it says lower the reading level, my teachers are typically going to see that and go, okay, well, I just need to give easier text to read, and that's it. This one here in the middle scares the pants off me. Lower difficulty level. That is just illegal. I mean, that is something that you would provide only for a student with, cognitive delays in an art, as, specifically scripted by the art, with very clear objectives. You would never tell a student, to lower the difficulty level in special ed without being very specific as to why that happened and what content that needs to happen in and to what degree. So for that to be listed here on just a blanket list of accommodations for an ESL student, just lower the difficulty level, that scares the heck out of me. How much lower are you making it, and why are you making it that low? And is it ever going to come back up to where it's at grade level? We're not providing less difficult work or less rigorous work as an accommodation. We're just making room for your language growth to not inhibit you from getting to that rigor. So when I see things like this, it becomes kind of clear how a lot of teachers can get mixed signals or lose the message of what we're really supposed to be doing if leadership is communicating things like this to them. So this is a problem. And we need to figure out how we're going to actually deal with that. So when moving forward with this, we need to recognize when we're accommodating language, what is the purpose of that accommodation? The purpose of that accommodation is actually, yes, to support the first language growth. A lot of students that are struggling in our classrooms a large part of that is because their first language has not been fully developed and there is nothing for them to attach the second language, English, to. So if a student has only social language in their native language and they don't have strong academic foundations in their first language, when we start to add that in English, it's going to be really, really difficult for that child to make sense of those things because there's nothing for them to connect it to in their own. So a lot of accommodations that you'll see will talk about using peer and native language support, using translation, bilingual dictionaries, things like that. We want to make sure that we are not cutting them off of the knees and taking away their foundation for learning, which is their first language. We want to make sure that we're keeping grade level learning in mind and that we're not reducing the expectations of our curriculum because we think that these students need so much help because of their language, when that's not the case. And most importantly, we want to have a growth mindset for these kids. When a kid walks into my classroom and I see that they have a need and that their language is limited, I don't want to continue to look at that student in that way and think that that is the only place that they can be. So we need to have a growth mindset and recognize that our efforts with that child are supposed to help them to improve and to increase their language proficiency and to become more educated and knowledgeable in our content. All right, so what we're going to do is walk through a sample lesson of where you could actually apply these accommodations authentically. And the conversation with that has a lot more to do with restructuring the way we teach and the learning environments that we make more than just adding an accommodation in. So what we're going to do is take an example objective. This comes from the Common Core in algebra. And so we're going to look at this and see what a child would be expected to know and do from this objective, and then see what kind of lesson we can build that actually lets an ELL attach to this linguistically. So for this algebra objective, it says, interpret functions that arise in applications in terms of the context. For a function that models a relationship between two quantities, interpret key features of graphs and tables in terms of the quantities, and sketch graphs showing key features given a verbal description of the relationship. Now, if you're not a math person, which, I will be honest, I am not. I supported Algebra 1 when I was a specialist, so I know a little bit, but there's a good chance I'm going to miss a lot of things here. So, if you are a math teacher, I apologize. But I chose math because first of all, I do understand when math teachers say there's not a lot of good examples for math, and I would like to help fix that. So here's one. Um, and two, I believe it's a subject that a lot of people, are kind of scared of, and our students struggle with as well. And I want to make sure that everybody can see that in any content, the things we're discussing can happen. And this is not just a English language thing, it's an all content thing. Okay, so we're talking about functional relationships, typically how they are related in graphs. All right, so if we're really going to be honest with ourselves and what students have to do, we would recognize that a student needs to, one, recognize a functional relationship taking place. They would need to also interpret how quantities affect each other, and they would need to demonstrate a high level of understanding by creating a graph that accurately depicts that relationship. So that is a lot for any student to do, especially any student who's also learning English. Because of that, a lot of times teachers would be tempted to reduce the level of this task and make it something a little more concrete. Maybe give the child a worksheet that's merely plotting points, or just give them kind of a rise and run thing to do. Follow the directions and map out the coordinate points and draw the line. And technically, yes, you created a graph. But are you actually fully understanding the concept of what you're doing and why you're doing it? Because this is a foundational skill that's going to carry into quadratics and cubic and other things that are going to continue on in Algebra 2. And if we don't have this down, the rest of those skills are not going to have anything to attach to. So it's really, really important that my students understand this fully and are able to do the thinking that is outlined here. So I need to make sure that I have a lesson that actually does that. So as I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to go through a sample lesson that shows how you can actually teach all of your students and authentically provide accommodations that lead towards growth and help ELLs think at rigorous levels. But to do that, it is a matter of restructuring our classrooms and having a different mindset about how we teach and what we teach than what we typically have done before. I cannot, in fairness, communicate to a teacher that, yes, you can continue what you're doing, here's your list of accommodations, and just try to fit them in where you can. That will never happen. It will literally never happen with authenticity. There's no way that a teacher can stand in the front of the room, be the primary deliverer of content, and be able to authentically accommodate their ELL's English language proficiency in their classroom. There's just no way to be able to individualize that. And because that's true, and that's what many teachers are feeling like, and they don't have the skills they need to branch out and teach in a different format, it creates a lot of bitterness. They feel, they know that they're not meeting that expectation. They're trying to justify whatever ways they can to say that, yes, I can check this box, that I met this accommodation, that, I gave you a chance to talk to your native language peer. I'm not sure if you were actually talking about algebra, but you did speak in Spanish, so, check. When you're feeling like you have to justify what you did and it's not really true, that doesn't make you feel like a very good educator, and I don't want educators to feel like that. So let's work on building the skills that we need to be able to really accommodate our learners and feel like we've actually impacted their growth. So to do that, I've kind of outlined a basic lesson format that can be easily followed, and I'm going to show you through each of the pieces of the framework how language accommodations would be applied at this point authentically to help all your students be able to learn together and really be seen as valued members of that class. So we're beginning with observing and learning the concept, discovering and learning for ourselves, calibrating and making sure that our ideas are accurate and correct, and then assessing the knowledge of our students. So we're going to go through one step at a time, kind of break it down. So in this sample lesson with the algebra and functional relationships and representing those on a graph, it's really important that my students think for themselves in this and that they make their own conclusions as to why this is significant and what they're supposed to learn from this. So a very, very simple thing to do is simply give them the visual of the graph, the description of what's going on, and let them make their own conclusions as to what's happening. What do you notice about the time and the files? What direction is that graph going? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What's the relationship between time and files? Which one is controlling which? Give the students, before you start teaching anything about the nuts and bolts of how to graph or anything like that, just time to just get the concept down. What do you notice in this graph? what is going on, how are these two things connected, what is the relationship between the time and the files, and let them talk about it with their peers. Doing so is going to help them build that conceptual understanding so they know why they're doing what they're doing later. When they're doing rise over run and they're trying to map out points on the graph, they know why they're doing it, and they know the relationship between their x and their y values. It helps them to determine the significance of the learning goal. So instead of just having my objective on the board, we actually know the objective and we know what we're trying to do because we spent some time thinking about it and talking about it. And at this point, we are creating a common frame of reference because there may be some kids in the room who have a better understanding of this by letting them talk to each other and observe and share their observations with each other first. We're taking that background knowledge of the few and spreading it to everybody, so that everybody has the same frame of reference, and we can all come back to this visual here. And when learning kind of gets hung up, to be able to explain what's going on. So to do that in this point, if I have ELLs in the room, I want them participating in this conversation meaningfully with everybody else. Because this is student driven, I can easily do that. At this point, I can provide peer and native language support. So when they're discussing with small groups, they can be speaking in English, but I can also have opportunities for them to speak in their native language too to make sense of this. That is a completely acceptable accommodation to do. If you're a monolingual English speaker and you were trying to learn something in another language, you would want to have some time to talk about it in English first. It's normal, that's natural. So that would be a perfect time to let that happen. We're trying to cement that concept, and if they need to speak in their native language for a minute to do that, let them do it. We're definitely using visual and verbal cues. So in this right here, I have lots of language for the students to attach to that they can be talking about. Having that visual in front of them is going to make it a lot easier to discuss it than if they just had to talk, period. So having that visual observation, it makes it a much easier to have conversation from. During this time, if I have students who really need a lot of help speaking, I can provide conversation stems, sentence stems to help with them attach to the conversation. Things like, I think blah blah blah, or I noticed blah blah blah, to help these students participate meaningfully in these conversations. So once we've observed and the students have nailed down the concept and made their own ideas, even if they're not completely accurate, it's okay, but they're still trying to make connections now. We're able to start discovering. So this is the point where they're actually going to learn the nuts and bolts of this objective for themselves. So this is the part that I think is the most crucial, because we're taking this responsibility off the teacher and putting it onto the children to learn for themselves. So we need for this objective to make sense, they need actual concrete content knowledge about algebra for this to work. Typically how that happens is somebody stands in front of the room and demonstrates it, and maybe the students will take notes on that or copy down some of the examples and follow along. When you do that, you're losing about 90% of your class, depending on who you have in the room. But there's a good chance that you're not actually meeting the needs of a lot of students when you're teaching that way, and even students are actually participating and copying, good chances they're not actually thinking at that time either. They're just copying, and which would make sense when you see the data of a lot of these courses and the assessments that we give, that they're not actually showing that they have understood these skills because they simply watched somebody do it. They didn't actually think about it for themselves. So once the kids have gotten the concept down and observe, when they go to discover, what we're doing is we're taking that responsibility off the teacher to provide all that content knowledge and putting it onto the students to go and learn and discover for themselves. So what I do at this point is I provide multiple points of learning for the students to choose from. This is coming from a article that Tan Nguyen has on his website, Empowering ELLs. The link is right here. You can see the full article that explains how to do this. But what I use is what's called text sets, and that is instead of me standing in front of the room and explaining a concept to the students, I'm providing a video, an infographic, a few articles, different resources that teach this concept in different ways that my students can choose from and learn from and take notes on. And so for that time, I'm going to make that very structured. I'm going to tell them, I'm going to give them a guiding question that they need to answer. In these notes that you're going to write for yourself, you need to be able to answer the question of what is a functional relationship, and how do you show that on a graph. Okay, so that's the guiding question you need to be able to answer with your notes. And to do that, you need to use a word bank of these key vocabulary and find what these terms are. So dependent variable, independent variable, things like that. So I'm going to make it very structured. I'm going to give my students multiple resources, and they have the choice with what resources they want to use. What's good about this is that you're differentiating without prescribing. I have multiple levels of resources. Maybe the video is a little more simple and it, explains things in a more basic way. But then the article, has like really mapped out the full scope of what this concept is. And say maybe I've given my students a total of 5 resources, and I say, okay, out of the 5, I need you to pick 3. So they're going to make choices about what is going to help them learn. And as they make those choices, I can help guide them. So say, for example, I have a student who wants to dive straight into the article, but it's really rigorous and it's a lot of language that maybe they haven't had exposure to, and they're really, really struggling. I still want them to read that article, but I can, go and see, okay, you're struggling. Why don't you go ahead and start with that video first, get that concept down, and then come back to the article. And I think it'll make more sense for you. So that way, the students and I are both working together to help them learn. It's not just me saying, oh, you're low, so let me give you the low level resource. You're high, so let me give you the high level resource. That way, I'm keeping students isolated to whatever level I think they already are in. And I don't want to do that. I want my students growing and learning, and the only way they can do that is to start making those decisions for themselves. So during the Discover time, it's really important that you have multiple ways for students to learn, and that it's a choice, and that through that time you're providing the structure of what are you trying to learn, what words you need to know, what guiding questions should you be answering. And the most important thing that's happening here is students are applying learning skills for themselves. They're thinking for themselves. I set the expectation that you can't copy anything. It needs to be written in your own words, so that students are actually showing their thinking and showing their understanding when they're taking notes during this time. It's not merely copying from my screen or my board what I think that they should know. They're making sense of it for themselves. Oops. So once that's happened and they've spent the time learning and using these resources and creating their ideas and taking notes on those things, many teachers might be curious, is it possible that they may have missed something, that they didn't quite understand that? How am I going to know if they really did get it? That's a very good question, and that needs to be addressed. So immediately after this time, it's really important that the students calibrate, that they talk to each other, and that they go from this, the small group level to the whole group level of what were we supposed to know? What were we supposed to learn from this? So beginning at the small group, having the students bring their notes together and say, this is what I thought we should learn. What do you think? Well, I thought we should have learned this, and I have these ideas. And coming together and making a common list or a common set of notes that they believe this is what we should have learned. And then each of those groups coming together as a class and saying, this is what we all agree we should have learned from this. And at this time, this is when the teacher can step back in and kind of guide things and recognize, okay, I'm seeing we're kind of going in a wrong direction here, or I like that idea, but I don't think you explained it fully, that kind of a thing. And so as we're doing that, it's, we have lots of ways that we can attach language to that. Again, because this is collaborative, we can have a chance for students to discuss both in English and in their native language and make that concept concrete. We can use visuals as we're doing this. If you look at this picture here, this teacher is taking the ideas and putting them onto the visual of the functional equation. That would be huge for any student, not just an ESL student, but as students are sharing, as groups are sharing their ideas. If we're, attaching those ideas visually to where they belong in the equation, how huge would that be? That would make so much more sense to a child to see all of their ideas going where they belong and actually making sense to the equation rather than just talking about it. So that visual would be huge. At this time, again, because we're having conversations, it would be really good for me to provide sentence frames for my students to help them talk and communicate with each other. I can also model pronunciation at this point. Many students, even non-ESL students, may struggle with how do you say some of these academic terms. So anybody would benefit from having a chance to just hear how to say some of this vocabulary that we're learning. And we're definitely clarifying words and phrases at this time. Because this is student-driven, I can do this more on an independent basis a lot more easily and actually meet my ESL students' real needs, because I am putting the ownership, the responsibility of learning into the students' hands, and that they're the ones having the conversations. I'm much more able to do these accommodations here authentically. So at this point, Our students have had a lot of opportunities to learn, to think, to make sure that they get it, and now is a chance to assess it, which can mean a lot more than just give them a quiz. That's one of the things I've listed here, but there's other things that you can do too that would be very meaningful. So at this point, because you have spent so much time, having students write and take notes, and we've made a huge class list. A really easy way to assess that would be, okay, take this class list we made, pick a graphic organization that you think is appropriate, and organize these ideas in your own way and show the relationships between those. That would be a huge way to recognize how much your students know, and that would require a lot of thinking on their part. And that because this is a math class, practice problems right now would be appropriate. I could see if you really understood what we were doing. And again, because this is at the individual level and the students are the ones doing this, I can easily provide some accommodations at this point for my ELLs and their English. So if they're having to write something, again, I can provide sentence stems. I can definitely give them some more time to work on this because this is complex and they're having to think in both languages and represent their understanding in English. They would require more time for this, but again, we would still be maintaining the expectation that this needs to be complex and show high-level thinking. At this point, using translation and a bilingual dictionary would definitely be appropriate. If you're trying to represent your understanding in English, using a dictionary to help you do that would make sense. You can also, because this is student-driven and individualized, I am able to help those students with a skill of recognizing once you've translated these words, what are you going to do with them? We don't want you to just translate it and then move on and forget it. How do you start recognizing the relationship between your language and English, and helping these students make those connections when they're translating. So because all of these parts of the framework are individualized, I can do those things more authentically and really work with my students to grow rather than check off the box, yeah, I gave you a translating dictionary. I don't know if you used it, but it was there. We don't want to do that. We don't want to justify accommodations. We want to actually provide them so that our students are learning and growing and actually increasing in their English language proficiency and increasing, most importantly, in their knowledge of our content. Oh, also, by the way, if you like this little document here, you can go to this link here and download it as a PDF. So I did make that available for you. All right, so wrapping this up, learning versus doing. We want to make sure that we walk away with this with the correct frame of reference. We want to have classrooms that are learning-centered, not action-centered, task-centered, doing-centered. And we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities for success for all of our students, and especially in this case for our ELLs. So when we're doing this, if we're doing this correctly, we are giving students time to think and learn for themselves. We're not going to get bogged down by our curriculum demands and think that we have to rush through everything just because we've got to move on to the next lesson. If we do that, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Rushing through gets nobody learning anything. So what's the point of doing that? So slow down, take the time to let your students think and discover for themselves what they are supposed to learn in your content. Give them those resources to really grapple with that. When you're letting your students read to learn, you're letting them think and you're letting them make sense of what they're supposed to learn, and they're actually going to walk away with that knowing more than if you just quickly ran through it and presented it to the class. The time makes the difference, and you will see it in your students' abilities. Doing that will also give your students time to apply metacognitive skills, like we talked about in the Discover section of that framework. By letting my students think and represent their understanding, they are making decisions about how I learn, what are my own struggles, what am I going to do to get unstuck when I don't understand. They can start applying all those skills because we're giving them the space to think. We want them using higher order thinking, period. If our objectives are explaining higher order thinking, that needs to happen for all students at all times, especially our ELLs. We shouldn't be denying them that because we think that their language is going to get in the way. And we want to see the authentic use of academic language in all domains, speaking, reading, writing. If that's happening in all content classes at all times, they're not just learning English better, they're learning your content better, and they're speaking like experts, which should be the point. And most importantly, we want to have true accommodations that develop language without lowering our expectations for the learning. If we're doing that, we are providing our students with the kind of education that they deserve. And ultimately, this shouldn't be what happens. If we are doing what we should be doing in our classrooms and we are really meeting the needs of these children and we're giving them opportunities to think the way that they're supposed to be thinking, that we're not just giving them tasks to complete and passing them along because we feel like that is our obligation, then we're going to see students when they walk across the stage and carry a diploma, that diploma will also carry with it the real skills that they need to move forward and pursue their own dreams and not feel like they were cheated out of an education. I don't want what happened to these boys to happen to any other kids. So it's really, really important that when we're in our classrooms, we see them in this way. You're not going to just be an 11-year-old, 15-year-old, 17-year-old forever. You're going to grow up. What am I doing today that is going to help that be more successful for you? So I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, you definitely can get in contact with me, and I would be happy to discuss with you. But I very much enjoyed presenting this, and I hope that the sound works this time. So thank you very much, and I will see you all around.